Watching DD Indian News, I'm Mark Lynn, and now let's introduce you to Professor Swaran Singh from the School of International Studies, JNU, and we are going to be discussing the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Uh, Professor Swaran Singh, we played a story out in the first half of our bulletin, and the analyst in our story, he was saying that the West knows that it's being played by Putin. What's the use then, of Ukraine's long-range weapons if they can't be used?
Very clearly, Putin has communicated, Mark, more than once that in case long range weapons are used to hit Russia, and then he would assume now that this has become a war between NATO and Russia. And as far as Kiev is concerned, both President Putin and former President Medvedev have threatened of use of nuclear weapons, saying that Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine, will turn into a grey dot, as they are saying. So they have repeatedly mentioned of the nuclear threat in case there is an involvement of long-range weapons. Now, between NATO allies, of course, there is an increasing demand now, of course, to respond to the requests one after another from July onwards, very formal requests from Ukraine to allow them to use, allow and supply them to use long-range weapons, because that is the only way to fend off
Okay.
Russian aggression, as they are saying. But there is apparently reluctance at the level of United States. Some of the allies are Romania, Latvia, Britain, of course, is also ahead in saying we should give long-range weapons. But US at this stage seems to be reluctant, and they want to continue to have more discussions about it.
Professor Swaran Singh, is there a diplomatic solution being ground out of this stalemate by slowly building up Ukraine's deterrence capability? Otherwise, this stalemate, seems to be indefinite.
Mark, it looks to me that from most of the European and North American allies of Ukraine who are supporting Ukraine's fight against Russia, the focus primarily has been in strengthening and equipping Ukraine in fighting the war. The focus on peace has been relatively, I think, not as strong and vehement as supporting the war against Russia has been, which is primarily because the war has not been simply a war between Ukraine and Russia. This has been a war between NATO on one side and Russia on the other. And in that sense, Russia also feels compelled, feeling that it treats itself as a superpower. And now it has faced for the first time in its history of 80 years that Ukraine has gone and occupied certain areas of Kursk region, for example. People are fleeing from there. Now, that is not a situation where Russia can easily think of starting any peace talks. So, direct conversations, despite Ukraine demanding that there should be now a second peace summit, is not apparently happening. Some countries, of course, including India, are making their efforts to make sure, in an incremental fashion, behind the closed doors, in a very imperceptible fashion, if they can really accelerate some kind of peace process which could result in an outcome of peace talks. But at this stage, I think focus from United States and its allies seems in supporting Ukraine in continuing that same war, but not allowing them to use long-range weapons, because that could get NATO involved into it. Indeed, let me mention in May of last year, Britain has already supplied long-range missiles called the Storm Shadows to Ukraine.
Yes.
That was supplied with the condition that those long-range missiles could only be used inside Ukrainian borders, given the fact that Russia was, taking a lot of space within eastern Ukraine at that time. But they are not supposed to use them on Russia, inside Russia. And that is the compulsion. And Ukraine, of course, wants to use it. UK also, it seems, Prime Minister is inclined to allow that use. In fact, 5 or 6 ministers have been public in United Kingdom. Foreign Minister David Lammy is on the lead, saying we should allow and we should not allow Russians to bully us into, not responding appropriately. So in
Okay.
that sense, the Prime Minister of UK, Starmer, was in Washington this Friday to discuss this with President Putin. But only UK, despite all the interest, cannot allow that, because the missile that I'm talking of, Storm Shadow, is a collaborative work of France, of Britain and Italy, and there are components of United States in that missile. So There has to be a
Right.
collective decision, and at this stage, I think they are only postponing that decision to be made.
So, Professor Swaran Singh, we were just showing a little while earlier on our screen as well. We saw the prisoners of war on their release. They really looked happy and relieved. And we see 933 days of war. So, do you see this month's UNGA at least focusing on some end to this conflict as well as the other conflict in West Asia?
There is no doubt that this conflict is up on the minds of most world leaders because it has global implications. So when we see leaders one after another speaking and addressing United Nations Security Council, UN General Assembly, we will see that the Ukraine crisis are a significant part of their speeches, and they will have their way of explaining what could be potential and possible solutions to it. But apparently, in large number of speeches at that stage would only be kind of lip service in showing the intent that various nations may have. But fundamentally, the crisis remains between the United States and Russia, and they have to blink first. In that sense, how they wish to move from war to peace. And at this stage, with Biden having just 4 months left in his presidency, and the precarious fashion in which Kamala Harris is becoming more popular now, and Democrats are becoming hopeful, the more in fights are now being seen in Republican Party. I don't think any decisive course correction will happen in next 4 months from United States side. So that's what we are seeing, dilly-dallying and basically postponing decisions and saying to Ukraine, please continue in the same fashion as you have continued so far, which is not very helpful in that sense. Of course, war would continue, and we will
Absolutely.
see that some incremental prisoners exchange could happen once in a while, but the bigger issue is not being resolved at this stage.
So, Professor Swaran Singh, have sanctions failed? And has the West basically overestimated the hold that they thought they had over global supply chains and the impact that they could have had with sanctions?
Sanctions, Mark, I for one have always held the view have not been very effective historically, other than in case of apartheid in South Africa, where there was a global consensus and there was very little way of how South Africa could survive and deal with those sanctions at that stage. Otherwise, whether it is North Korea or our neighboring Myanmar, Russia now more recently, uh, sanctions have not been very effective, partly because they're not consensus driven. The whole world doesn't support sanctions, particularly when sanctions are imposed by individual nations outside United Nations. And there are always ways to skirt through sanctions, and there are always countries that are willing to do business for whatever reasons they may have on their own. So sanctions are largely symbolic in that sense, and sanctions in that sense also often hurt people who are not responsible for decisions for which sanctions are being made. So we talk of smart sanctions, but even smart sanctions ultimately end up, pinching and paining people who are not really responsible for decisions. And therefore, I think it's largely symbolic. It's largely show of intent that we are not happy with the way things are happening as far as the target country is concerned upon which sanctions are imposed. But sanctions, I think, have not worked in at least history of last 100 years. That's my assumption, other than exception of South Africa.
Okay, we leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Swaran Singh. Thank you for joining us and enlightening us on the current state of play between on the war, the battleground actually between Russia and Ukraine. Now let's look at other stories.